Mr. Chair, can we allot 5 minutes time to the representative from Maryland?
Mr. Gallegos, thank you very much.
The gentleman from Arizona cannot yield a block of time. You can yield.
Oh, apologies. I yield time to Mr. Raskin from Maryland. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. I wanted to bring the good news, Mr. Speaker, to Congress about where we are on the gun violence debate. Because I know there have been a lot of accusations flying back and forth. And I want us to look for the common ground. And I want to bring the good news today. And the good news is that we actually have an overwhelming policy consensus in America as to what we need to do about gun violence. And we have an overwhelming, indeed a unanimous judicial consensus about what's constitutional to do. And I want us to focus on that. And then that will allow us to isolate what the problem is in dislodging the paralysis in Washington today. But let's start with the overwhelming policy consensus that has emerged in the wake of a sequence of massacres. And it's enough to invoke their names to remind people of the bloodshed that is engulfing our society. In Parkland, Florida, in San Bernardino, California, in Las Vegas, in Texas, at Virginia Tech, at Sandy Hook, in Newtown, Connecticut, and so on. In the wake of all these massacres, America's demanding action. But here's the good news. Everybody has agreed. As close to unanimous agreement as you're ever going to find in the United States of America has emerged. 97% of the American people favor a universal criminal and mental background check on all firearm purchases in America. That is the overwhelming majority of Democrats, the overwhelming majority of Republicans, the overwhelming majority of independents, the overwhelming majority of gun owners, the overwhelming majority of non-gun owners, almost everybody in America. 97 out of 100 people. And if you take the margin of error, it might be 99 out of 100 people agree that firearms should not be sold without a background check so that criminals and gang members and terrorists can't go to a gun show and acquire a weapon of war and then use it in our schools, in our movie theaters, in our churches, in the public square. So we've got virtually unanimous public consensus on that, and every public opinion poll is showing the same thing, except the numbers continue to go up. Now, some people will say in response to this, aha, but the Second Amendment won't allow us to do anything. There are a lot of people in this debate who are now wrapping themselves in the flag of the Second Amendment and saying the Second Amendment prohibits us from implementing this overwhelming public mandate for a universal criminal and mental background check. But they're wrong, and we know that they're wrong. The Supreme Court in 2008 in the District of Columbia versus Heller case interpreted the Second Amendment definitively for us, at least sufficiently for us to understand that a background check is perfectly constitutional. In the Heller case, the Supreme Court first divided over the question of whether or not the Second Amendment confers a collective militia-based right or an individual right. 4 justices said that the text of the Second Amendment means that you only have a right to a firearm in connection with militia service, which today we would call National Guard service. And you'll recall the language of the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And 4 justices suggested that your right to bear and keep an arm is tethered to service in the militia. But that view lost. 5 justices took the individual rights view that the so-called prefatory clause just announces the purpose of the Second Amendment, but it defines an individual right, okay? But 9 justices, the entire Supreme Court, agreed that whether the right was collective or individual in nature, that right is subject to reasonable regulation by Congress and by the states. And of course, that's got to be right. Every right, all fundamental rights are subject to reasonable regulation by the government. Think about the First Amendment, which guarantees the right of free speech. It gives you the right to go out and march in front of the White House, but does it give you the right to march in front of the White House at 2 o'clock in the morning with bullhorns and to wake up the president's family? Of course not. The First Amendment is conditioned on reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, the Supreme Court held in a case called Ward versus Rock against Racism, where the court said it was perfectly fine for New York City to require people to turn the sound down when they have a concert in Central Park because there are other social activities taking place. And the Second Amendment is the exact same way, said the Supreme Court. You have a right to possess a handgun for self-defense. You have a right to a rifle for purposes of hunting and recreation. You don't have a right to a machine gun. There's no constitutional right to carry a sawed-off shotgun. There's no constitutional right to carry weapons of war in public places. There's no right to carry a firearm into public buildings, said Justice Scalia, into public schools, into the U.S. Congress. There's no constitutional right for that, and there's certainly no constitutional right for anybody to access a weapon without passing through the regulatory screen that the government sets up. And that's the common sense of the American people, too. You know, Tom Paine, who wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, said that common sense is essential in a democracy because it's the sense that we have in common. And the sense that we have in common today about guns, that we need a universal criminal and mental background check, is something that is nearly unanimously held, and it's something that clearly passes constitutional muster according to the Supreme Court's decision in the District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008. So we got a public policy consensus, a popular consensus, and a constitutional juridical consensus about the right thing to do and the constitutional thing to do. And yet, what do we have here in Congress? We've got paralysis. We've got absolute inaction and defiance of the public will. And why? Well, nobody really says. The GOP leaders, Mr. Speaker, simply refuse to bring a universal background check bill to the floor of Congress. They won't even permit a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee about it, despite the fact that that's what everybody wants and that's what the times demand right now. Why? Well, have we become a failed state? Are we unable to govern? Does democracy not work anymore? Is that what we're saying? Or I hope not. I hope we've not become a failed state. I hope we are able to address the public safety needs of the people. I hope we're able to address the democratic will of the American public, and I hope we're able to effectuate the majority will of Congress, because we know that forced to a vote that a majority of Congress would support this. So what's going on? Well, James Madison in Federalist 10 predicted it well, where he talked about the problem of faction. He said, a minority of people animated by some passion or some common interest that goes against the rights of the rest of the public and against the common good, against the general interest of the people. But our institutions have got to be set up to legislate over the demands of one small faction, the 2 or 3% of the people who don't want to see a universal background check because they spread the mythology that any gun safety regulation will lead to a confiscation of people's firearms, which is utterly absurd and ridiculous and demonstrably false. And yet that tiny group of people, that tiny faction, has been allowed in this Congress to control the public agenda and to dictate to everybody else. When we have tens of thousands, and soon on Saturday, March 24th, hundreds of thousands of young people marching for the most elementary right of life in a civil society. And what's that? The right to security and safety. The whole reason we've got a social contract. If you read your Thomas Hobbes, you read your John Locke, you read your Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the whole basis of civil society is we will be safer entering in to the social contract than we would be if we stuck it out in the state of nature, which John Locke described and Hobbes described as a war of all against all, where life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. So we're asking for the leadership in Congress simply to act. Let us bring this bill to the floor of Congress and stop with the distractions and the deflections and the diversions. They can bring up 50 other things. The people of America know, with our common sense, we need a universal criminal and mental background check for everyone. And Mr. Speaker, I would love it if someone could explain why that legislation is not allowed to see the light of day on the floor of the House, not even a hearing or a vote in the House Judiciary Committee. This is a public emergency. And the young people of America, beginning with the heroic kids, the survivors in Parkland, Florida, will not let us off the hook. One of them was asked the question, well, why suddenly have you unleashed this revolution across the country against one minor faction control of all of Congress? Why did it happen now, but it didn't happen back at Sandy Hook? And one of the young leaders said, at Sandy Hook, they assassinated with an AR-15 at point-blank range first graders. But in Parkland, Florida, they assassinated high school students. And we are more educated, and we have a voice, and we know how social media works. And there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. There's going to be no avoiding this question. At the very least, we must have a vote on a universal criminal and mental background check for all firearm purchases in the United States of America. The people want it. The Supreme Court has made it clear that such legislation is constitutional. In Maryland in 2013, we passed not only fingerprint licensing universal background check, we passed a ban on military-style assault weapons, a ban on high-capacity magazines. These are bans that are, again, favored by more than 2/3 of the American people. And it was challenged in court, in federal district court in Maryland. It was upheld against Second Amendment attack. They appealed it to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. It was upheld against Second Amendment attack. And they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court let it stand. So within the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, within our circuit, we've already got all of the legislation upheld as constitutional, which some people are saying you can't do because of the Second Amendment. Stop hiding behind the Second Amendment. Stop hiding behind it. The Second Amendment is just like every other amendment. You can pass a reasonable regulation as long as you don't destroy the underlying right itself. Nobody is trying to take away anyone's handgun for self-defense. No one's trying to take away anyone's rifle for hunting and recreational purposes. But you don't need an AR-15 in order to go hunting. Any real hunter will tell you. And you certainly don't need this to allow the sale of firearms in the United States of America to criminals and terrorists and gang members in order to support the Second Amendment. That is ludicrous. It's absurd, and we should stop spreading that propaganda. Mr. Speaker, or I don't know if Mr. Gallo is still here, I'm going to yield back my time. I thank you very much for the courtesy of the time, and I think it's just so important that we get this message out to the American public.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that for 242 years, whenever and wherever America's freedom has been threatened, we called in the Marines. A Marine Corps rifle platoon, rifle squad, is trained to close with and destroy the enemy by fire and maneuver. That's what we do. That's our purpose. Marines kick in the door and kill the bad guys, period. I know, because that's what I had to do in Iraq. My platoon fought door to door against deadly insurgents. And for this mission, the Marine Corps issued me an M16A4. The M16 is a weapon designed with exquisite precision for the singular purpose of killing as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. It's not for deer hunting, it's for killing people. The original M16 was relentlessly refined to take enemy lives in combat. But you might know the version available in stores. It's called an AR-15. But Republicans and their bosses at the NRA believe almost anyone should be able to carry this weapon of war. That's right. Republicans honestly believe that this killing machine has a place in our communities. They think that a weapon very similar to one that I carry in Al-Anbar belongs on the streets of Phoenix. That's idiotic, and I'll explain why. Republicans aren't just ignoring the voices of the victims, the thousands of voices. They're also just denying basic physics. Because a round from an AR-15 is larger and leaves the muzzle traveling faster, it will impact the body with about 3 times more energy than a bullet from a handgun. Surgeons treating Parkland victims described organs that looked like, and I quote, overripe melons smashed by a sledgehammer. They talk about exit wounds as big as oranges. They recount opening bodies of these children, hoping to stem the bleeding, and discovering that, as one doctor put it, there was nothing left to repair. And here's the thing. That's not an unexpected outcome. Delivering fatal wounds that no surgeon can fix is the whole point of these weapons. That's precisely why they were given to us for combat. The AR-15 also has a standard magazine of 30 rounds. Those 30 rounds are necessary if you're putting down suppressive fire or engaging insurgents. They're not very useful when you're hunting deer. And Mr. Speaker, I can confidently say that if you need more than a handful of shots to take down a deer, you are probably the problem, not the weapon. In addition, the AR-15 has a significantly faster effective rate of fire than a bolt-action hunting rifle or a handgun. That means you can shoot more people in less time. That means police officers responding to the scene of a shooting will be outgunned and outmatched. That means more children will die in the classrooms before help can arrive. I went through literally thousands of hours of training to become a Marine. It was arduous and grueling. I was taught how to clean and care for my weapon. I had to pass a rigorous marksmanship test, and I was only armed after I learned the privilege and the responsibility of that weapon. In contrast, my Republican friends think that anyone should be able to walk into a sporting goods store anywhere in America and walk out with an AR-15. When children are slaughtered in their classrooms, we respond with thoughts and prayers instead of smarter policies or stronger laws. We're asked to simply accept this bloodshed as an unavoidable fact of American life. Not anymore. How about this? Let's reform our background check system. Let's ban assault rifles and keep weapons of war out of our communities. Then, if people are truly desperate to fire those types of weapons, they can do what I do. Go to www.marines.mil and enlist. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will receive a message.